The judge didn't look at me when she read the decision. She looked straight at my husband. "The house," she said evenly, "will remain with Mr. Carter. All marital savings and investments will be transferred to him. And based on the evidence presented, full legal and physical custody of the children is awarded to the father." The words landed one after another, heavy and final. My husband exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding his breath for months. He didn't try to hide his smile. He reached over and squeezed his attorney's hand, then turned, just briefly, to look at me. Victory. That was the expression, clean, certain, almost relieved. I sat perfectly still. No tears, no reaction. My lawyer glanced at me once, checking, but I gave a small nod. I was fine. Or at least, I looked fine. I had learned a long time ago how to appear calm when something inside me was collapsing. The judge continued, outlining visitation schedules, procedures, formalities. I barely heard them. My focus stayed on my husband's shoulders. How relaxed they were now. How confident. Like a man who believed the story had finally ended in his favor. When the gavel came down, he stood immediately. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, respectful. The voice he used in public, the one people trusted. He didn't look back at me as he walked out of the courtroom. Not once. I waited until the room cleared before I stood. My legs felt hollow, like they didn't quite belong to me. Outside, in the hallway, his family was already gathered. His sister, his mother, a cousin. They wrapped him in hugs, murmuring congratulations like he'd just closed a business deal instead of dismantled a marriage. I stayed back. Someone brushed past me and whispered, "I'm sorry," without stopping. My lawyer touched my elbow. "We'll talk later," she said quietly. "When you're ready." I nodded. Because this loss, had been expected. What none of them knew was that the moment my husband stood in court and claimed everything, every account, every asset, every decision, he had finally done something he'd spent years avoiding. He'd put his name on the truth. 3 years earlier, when the investigation first started, the blame had landed on me. It always did. The missing funds, the irregular transfers, the forged authorization. My name had been the one attached to the account that raised questions. My signature, digitized, replicated, conveniently placed, had been flagged. My husband had looked stunned then, hurt, betrayed. "I don't understand," he'd said to the auditors, his arm protectively around me. She handled the paperwork. I trusted her. I remembered standing there, numb, trying to process how quickly the room had turned, how easily people believed him, how natural it seemed that I must have been careless, or dishonest, or overwhelmed. The wife, the administrator, the one who helped. I hadn't fought it. Not at first. Because when I asked questions, he told me to calm down. When I wanted a lawyer, he said it would make us look guilty. When I asked to see the records, he said I wouldn't understand them. He was always very good at sounding reasonable. By the time I realized what had happened, how thoroughly the finances had been controlled, how carefully the access had been limited, it was too late. The narrative had already set. And now, in that courtroom, he had doubled down on it. He hadn't just taken the house. He hadn't just taken the money. He hadn't just taken the children. He had taken ownership. Every account he insisted on keeping, every document he claimed responsibility for, every decision he testified had been solely his. I followed them out of the building slowly, the sound of his family's laughter echoing down the steps ahead of me. He was already talking about logistics, about moving things forward, about how relieved he was this was finally over. He believed the divorce was the end. For me, it was the beginning. Because the truth doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits. And sometimes, the person most eager to win makes sure it finally has nowhere else to land. The first time my husband blamed me, it wasn't in court. It was at our kitchen table late at night, when the kids were asleep and the house felt unusually quiet. He slid his laptop toward me, the screen filled with spreadsheets and highlighted rows I didn't recognize. "There's a problem," he said calmly. Too calmly. I leaned forward, scanning the numbers. "What kind of problem?" "Missing funds," he replied. "Not a lot yet, but enough to raise questions." I frowned. "From where?" "Our investment account," he said. "The one in your name." That was true. The account was technically under my name, because years earlier he'd told me it would simplify taxes. He handled the logins, the passwords, the transfers. I signed what he put in front of me. "I don't move money," I said slowly. "You know that." He rubbed his face, like he was exhausted by the conversation already. "I know. I'm just saying the account is flagged." Flagged. The word lodged in my chest. "So what do we do?" I asked. He didn't hesitate. "We cooperate. We explain that you managed the paperwork, that there was a mistake." I stared at him, but I didn't make one. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Of course you didn't. But this kind of thing happens. The important thing is staying united." United. I clung to that word longer than I should have. When the auditors contacted us weeks later, my husband played the role perfectly. Concerned husband. Supportive partner. He answered questions for me before I could. Clarified things I hadn't said. Redirected when I looked confused. "She gets overwhelmed with numbers," he explained gently. "That's why I usually help." I felt myself shrinking with every sentence. When the possibility of legal consequences was raised, he reacted with visible shock. "This could ruin her," he said. "She's not equipped for this." That night, he told me we needed to be strategic. "If you lawyer up," he said, "they'll assume guilt. Let me handle it." I believed him. I had believed him for years. About money, about timing, about what I could and couldn't manage. I believed him when he said my name on the account was just a formality, when he said I didn't need to worry about details. So when the narrative hardened, when my role quietly shifted from administrative to responsible, I didn't fight it. Not because I was guilty, because I was married. By the time the marriage cracked under the weight of suspicion and resentment, the damage was already done. Friends withdrew. Whispers started. His family became distant. And through it all, he remained steady. "I tried to protect you," he told people, but she wouldn't listen. At home, he grew colder, more precise. He documented everything: conversations, schedules, my reactions. When I finally asked to see the full financial records, he looked at me like I'd insulted him. "Why now?" he asked. "Don't you trust me?" That was the first time I felt it. Something sharp beneath the calm. Not fear. Control. I started saving copies quietly. Emails, statements. Nothing obvious, nothing confrontational. Just enough to understand the pattern. And the pattern was simple. I didn't have access. I never had. Every transfer traced back to devices I didn't use. Times I wasn't awake. Locations I hadn't been. But proving that required something I didn't have yet: time. When my husband asked for the divorce, he framed it as mercy. "This has been hard on you," he said. "The stress, the accusations. Maybe space would help." I agreed. Because I knew something he didn't. Space doesn't just separate people, it reveals them. And the more distance he put between us, the clearer the truth became. The divorce process moved faster than I expected. My husband filed first. That should have been my warning. In the petition, he positioned himself as the stable parent, the one who handled finances, schedules, decisions. He described me as emotionally overwhelmed and ill-equipped to manage complex matters. The same language he'd used with the auditors, now repurposed for custody. Reading it felt like watching my life be summarized by someone who had already decided the ending. My lawyer raised an eyebrow when she saw it. "He's asking for everything." "I know," I said. "What do you want to contest?" I hesitated. That hesitation nearly cost me everything. Because there was the obvious loss: the house, the money, the kids. And then there was the other thing, the one that hadn't gone away. The investigation that had never fully closed, only stalled. The shadow that still followed my name. If I fought him aggressively, if I dragged everything into the light too soon, he'd do what he always did. He'd redirect. So I chose silence. Strategically. During discovery, my husband submitted detailed statements claiming exclusive control over all marital finances for efficiency. He testified, confidently, that he alone managed investments, taxes, and transfers, that I signed when asked, but didn't understand the mechanisms. My lawyer glanced at me when he said it. I kept my face neutral. Inside, something settled into place. Because every word he spoke wasn't just about custody or property. It was a record. Emails started coming in from third parties around the same time. Banks requesting clarification, institutions asking for confirmation of authority. He answered all of them himself, copying his attorney, establishing a clear paper trail. I handled it. I approved it. I was responsible. He thought he was building a fortress. What he was actually doing was drawing a map. The hearing approached quickly. Friends asked if I was okay. His family stopped speaking to me entirely. The kids, confused, careful, watched every interaction like they were bracing for something to break. The night before court, I sat alone at my kitchen table, scrolling through old files on my laptop. Timestamps, IP logs, access records. I didn't need to prove everything. I just needed him to say the right thing. In court, he was calm, prepared, polite. When his attorney asked about the finances, he answered without hesitation. I oversaw all accounts, he said. I made the decisions. I took responsibility. The judge nodded, appreciative of clarity. I felt my heart pound, but my face stayed still. When my lawyer asked if I wanted to respond, I shook my head. Not yet. Let him talk. Let him claim it all. By the time the judge ruled in his favor, granting him the house, the money, and custody, the room felt oddly quiet, like the sound had dropped out of a scene just before something irreversible happens. As we stood to leave, he leaned toward me and whispered, "You should have trusted me." I looked at him then. Really looked. I did, I said softly. That was the truth. And it was also the last mistake I would ever make on his behalf. Because trust, once broken, doesn't always shatter loudly. Sometimes it sharpens. And sometimes it waits for the exact moment someone finally says enough. Out loud, on the record, under oath. The weeks after the hearing were the loneliest of my life. Not because I was alone, but because everything familiar had been taken from me so efficiently it felt unreal. The house was no longer mine. The bank accounts were frozen or transferred. My time with the kids was suddenly reduced to scheduled hours supervised by people who watched me like I might disappear with them. And yet, beneath the grief, there was something else. Relief. Because the pretending was finally over. I moved into a small apartment across town. It was quiet. Too quiet at first. I slept on a mattress on the floor and ate standing up because I hadn't bought a table yet. Every night I replayed the hearing in my head. Not the ruling, but my husband's testimony. I handled all finances. I made the decisions. I was responsible. He had said it clearly, repeatedly, confidently. 2 weeks later, the letter arrived. Not from my lawyer. From the Financial Crimes Unit. My hands shook as I opened it. Old fear rushing back on instinct. For years, that kind of envelope had meant danger, another reminder that my name was still attached to something rotten. But this letter was different. It wasn't accusatory. It was procedural. They were reopening the investigation. Specifically, they were requesting clarification from the individual who had testified under oath to having sole control over the disputed accounts. My husband. I sat on the edge of my mattress and laughed once, softly, almost disbelieving. I hadn't reported him. I hadn't submitted evidence. I hadn't accused. I hadn't needed to. The court transcript had done the work for me. Over the next month, I watched from a distance as his confidence began to crack. He missed one scheduled pickup of the kids, then another. His attorney stopped returning calls as quickly. Mutual acquaintances mentioned he was under a lot of stress. One afternoon, he called me for the first time since the hearing. "You knew," he said without greeting. I stayed silent. "You set me up," he continued, his voice tight now. "You let me say all that." "No," I replied calmly. "You chose to." There was a pause. I could hear him breathing. "They're asking questions," he said. "This isn't what we agreed on." "We didn't agree on anything," I said. "You told the truth." "That's not what I meant," he snapped. "It's what you said," I replied. He hung up. A week later, my lawyer called. "They've formally reassigned liability," she said. "Based on his testimony and the access records, you're no longer considered a subject." I closed my eyes. For the first time in years, my name was clean. The custody arrangement was revisited shortly after that. Not because I asked, but because an ongoing financial investigation made him an unstable guardian in the court's eyes. Temporary changes were ordered, supervision reassigned. The kids noticed. They always do. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel victorious. What I felt was something quieter and deeper. Justice doesn't always look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like watching someone finally carry what he insisted was his all along. And for the first time since this began, I wasn't afraid of what came next. Because the truth had stopped needing my protection. The investigation moved slowly, the way real consequences always do. There were no dramatic arrests, no flashing lights, just letters, requests, timelines. The kind of pressure that doesn't explode, it tightens. My husband started unraveling in small, visible ways. He sent messages late at night that I didn't answer. He missed deadlines he used to pride himself on never missing. At exchanges with the kids, he looked distracted, thinner, his confidence replaced by something sharp and brittle. The children noticed before anyone else. "Dad's always on the phone now," my oldest said one afternoon, trying to sound casual. "He gets mad a lot." I kept my voice steady. Adults deal with stress badly sometimes. I didn't add that he was dealing with stress he had created himself. The court ordered a temporary custody review while the investigation was ongoing. Nothing final yet, just adjustments. More time with me, less with him. A neutral supervisor present. He protested loudly. He told the judge this was retaliation, that I was manipulating the system, that I was unstable. The judge listened, then asked a simple question. "Is it true," she said, "that you testified under oath to having sole control over the finances now under investigation?" "Yes," he replied, "because I did." "And is it true," she continued, "that the alleged misconduct occurred during the period you claim exclusive authority?" He hesitated. "Yes, that was all it took." Outside the courtroom, he finally lost the composure he'd worn like armor for years. "This was supposed to be over," he hissed at me, keeping his voice low. "You were supposed to move on." I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt something close to pity. "You took everything," I said quietly. "I just let you." The house he'd fought so hard to keep became a liability. Accounts were frozen pending review. His attorney advised him to say less, not more. The silence he'd once imposed on me wrapped itself around him instead. Friends stopped calling. His family, who had celebrated the hearing like a victory, grew distant. They didn't ask me questions. They asked him why things weren't settling down. The kids adjusted faster than either of us expected. Children understand fairness long before adults do. They notice the calm in my apartment, the absence of tension, the fact that no one was monitoring their words. One night after I tucked them in, my youngest asked, "Are you still in trouble, Mom?" I sat on the edge of the bed. "No," I said. "I never was." They nodded, satisfied, and turned over to sleep. That moment nearly broke me, not because of the pain, but because of the clarity. because I realized how close I had come to letting their entire understanding of me be shaped by a lie someone else told convincingly. The final update came 6 months later. My lawyer called me at work. "They're proceeding," she said. "Formal charges, financial misconduct, fraud." I closed my office door and sat down. "What happens now?" I asked. "For you?" she replied. "Nothing. You're done." I thanked her and hung up, hands trembling, not with fear, but release. That evening, I walked past the house I used to live in. The lights were off. A for sale sign stood on the lawn. I didn't stop, because that life wasn't mine anymore. My husband had believed that taking everything would erase the past, that control would equal closure, that if he won loudly enough, no one would look closely. What he never understood was this: truth doesn't chase you, it waits. And the moment you insist on owning everything, every asset, every decision, every responsibility, you also inherit what comes with it. I hadn't lost my voice in that courtroom. I'd saved it, for the moment it mattered most. By the time the case became public, I had already stopped following it closely. Not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer defined me. The headlines were careful, almost polite. Financial irregularities, mismanagement of assets, no mention of marriage, no mention of blame. Just facts, laid out in a way that didn't need embellishment. People started reaching out again. Old friends, former colleagues, even a few who had quietly stepped back when my name was first questioned. "I always thought something felt off," they said. "I never believed you could do that." I'm glad the truth came out. I listened, I thanked them, and I noticed something important. None of those conversations changed how I felt, because validation, once you've learned to live without it, loses its power. The custody arrangement was revised permanently not long after, not dramatically. Just a series of adjustments that slowly returned balance, shared time, shared decisions, stability. The judge didn't apologize. Courts don't. She simply acknowledged the updated facts and ruled accordingly. That was enough. The kids settled into a rhythm that felt natural instead of forced. They stopped asking careful questions. They stopped checking my reactions before sharing stories. They laughed more, slept better. So did I. One afternoon, my ex tried to call again. The number was blocked, but the voicemail came through anyway. Strained, defensive, desperate in a way I had never heard before. "They're making this sound worse than it was," he said. "You know I never meant to hurt anyone." I deleted it without listening to the rest. Intent doesn't erase impact, and explanations don't undo evidence. The strangest part was how ordinary life felt once the storm passed. I grocery shopped. I worked. I helped with homework. I made plans that didn't include contingency strategies for someone else's anger. I started trusting my own memory again. That might have been the biggest change. For years, I had second-guessed myself, my instincts, my understanding, my recollection of events. I had accepted confusion as my fault, doubt as my nature. Now I knew better. I wasn't confused. I had been misled. And once the fog lifted, the landscape made sense. I didn't celebrate his downfall. I didn't attend hearings. I didn't tell the kids details they didn't need. What happened to him was no longer my responsibility. I had already done my part by stepping out of the way and letting the truth stand on its own. The irony wasn't lost on me. He had spent years telling everyone I was reckless, unreliable, dangerous with responsibility. And in the end, the only thing I did was listen and let him speak. He had insisted on taking the house, insisted on taking the money, insisted on taking custody. He had insisted on being the one in control. Control, it turned out, came with accountability. And once that door opened, it didn't close again. The last time I saw my ex was in a courthouse hallway, months after everything had settled. Not during a hearing, not during an argument, just passing each other between doors. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, just diminished. The certainty that had once filled every space around him was gone. In its place was something restless, unfocused, like a man still searching for a version of the story where he was in control. He nodded at me, polite, careful. I nodded back and kept walking. That was it. No confrontation, no final words, no satisfaction delivered in a neat, cinematic moment. Because real endings don't announce themselves, they simply stop asking for your attention. The house he took was sold to cover legal fees. The accounts he claimed were audited down to the smallest transaction. The custody he fought so hard for became shared, not as a victory for me, but as a necessity for the children. They didn't need a hero. They needed stability. And stability doesn't come from domination. It comes from truth. People sometimes ask if I planned it, if I knew, sitting in that courtroom, exactly what would happen when I let him take everything. The honest answer is no. I didn't plan revenge. I planned survival. All I did was stop interrupting him while he built his own case. I let him speak the way he always had, confident, absolute, certain that control would protect him from consequences. It never does. The crime he blamed on me didn't disappear just because the marriage ended. It waited, patient, documented, bound to the person who insisted on owning every decision tied to it. That person wasn't me. I didn't win in the way people expect wins to look. There were no cheers, no apologies from the people who doubted me, no dramatic reckoning that erased the years I spent carrying someone else's guilt. What I got was better. I got my name back. I got my credibility back. I got my children without fear attached to my presence. And I got something I didn't even realize I'd lost: trust in myself. At the divorce hearing, my ex took the house, the money, and full custody, never knowing he had just claimed the crime he blamed on me. He thought taking everything would erase the past. All it did was force the truth to finally land exactly where it belonged. And once it did, I didn't need to say another word.